The vast frozen desolation of the Arctic Ocean, far north of the Norwegian Sea and stretching towards the permanent polar ice cap, was a theater of war so remote, so punishing, that it was dismissed by most strategists as utterly impractical. This was a realm defined by perpetual twilight, blinding blizzards, and temperatures that could shatter bone, a landscape where survival itself was the primary enemy. Yet, for the German Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe weather services, this forbidding silent front was crucial. The ability to accurately forecast weather patterns originating in the Arctic, the relentless cold engines of global climate, was a strategic imperative. Accurate, long-range weather data was essential for planning naval movements, U-boat deployments, and, critically, for predicting the conditions that would govern the massive air campaigns over Western Europe and the final battles on the Eastern Front. Without this data, the German High Command was essentially fighting blind, gambling against the most powerful, unpredictable force on the planet, the weather itself. The solution devised by the Germans was audacious and borderline insane. The establishment of remote, automated or manned meteorological stations deep within the territory of Allied nations or on desolate, uninhabited islands. These outposts, supplied by U-boat or long-range aircraft, represented an extreme exercise in logistical determination, pushing the limits of human endurance and technological capability. The focus of this incredible effort falls upon a small, forgotten operation, an experiment in extreme isolation known as Unternehmen Houdingen, Operation Houdingen, a secret weather station established on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, a desolate, icebound land far from the main lines of conflict. The decision to place a manned station so deep within the Arctic Circle was a high-stakes gamble on the part of the German Naval Command, a realization that the risk of discovery was outweighed by the strategic value of the meteorological intelligence. The successful operation of such a base required a confluence of factors: a highly specialized team, unique engineering solutions to withstand the polar climate, and a logistical chain capable of crossing thousands of miles of hostile, stormy ocean. The team selected for Houdingen were not typical soldiers. They were a mixture of experienced meteorologists, radio operators, and naval specialists, men chosen for their technical proficiency, mental resilience, and ability to endure months of total isolation. Their mission was straightforward but relentlessly demanding: record and transmit weather data, temperature, wind speed, barometric pressure, several times a day, maintaining a continuous, accurate stream of intelligence back to the German command centers. Their base, a small cluster of prefabricated huts reinforced against the fierce Arctic gales, was a tiny, fragile bastion of civilization clinging to a coastline dominated by ice and polar bears. The establishment of the base itself was a massive logistical undertaking, requiring the deployment of a U-boat, the U-307, to transport the men, months of provisions, specialized scientific equipment, and sufficient armament to repel the unlikely, yet ever-present, threat of Allied discovery. The entire operation was a study in logistical and human vulnerability, a strategic commitment to an outpost so remote that the concept of retreat was almost meaningless. The men understood implicitly that once the supply U-boat departed, they were entirely alone, reliant solely on their own resources and the slim chance of resupply in the short summer window. Their environment was the world's most efficient prison, a cold, vast emptiness that promised certain death for any mistake. The strategic intelligence gathered by these remote Arctic stations was, for a time, invaluable. The data provided a crucial missing piece of the puzzle for German long-range weather forecasting, allowing for greater confidence in planning naval operations in the North Atlantic and the timing of airstrikes over England. The meticulous recordings transmitted from the Arctic helped planners predict the persistent high-pressure systems and the sudden, violent low-pressure storms that characterized the northern European climate. This flow of information was a silent, invisible contribution to the German war effort, a strategic asset whose value could not be measured in simple tonnage or casualty counts, but in the successful execution of complex military maneuvers. The men of Houdingen were not frontline heroes. They were strategic operators, technicians fighting a cold, analytical battle against the chaos of the atmosphere. Yet, like all isolated ventures in the massive global conflict, the long-term viability of the secret Arctic base was a doomed race against the inevitable mobilization of overwhelming Allied resources and the crushing, relentless power of the natural environment itself. The initial success was a testament to German ingenuity. The eventual collapse would be a testament to Allied dominance. The individual commitment to this scientific mission, pushed to the extreme limits of human and mechanical capability, revealed the immense strategic importance Germany placed on controlling the unpredictable elements, a control that was ultimately unattainable against the systematic power of the opposing forces. The Arctic's cold indifference became a silent collaborator with the Allied war machine. The continued operation of the secret Arctic weather base, Unternehmen Haudegen, depended entirely on a single, fragile lifeline: the logistical support provided by the German U-boat fleet. The supply mission was arguably one of the most difficult and high-risk tasks assigned to the Kriegsmarine during the entire war. It demanded extreme skill, precise timing, and an improbable degree of luck, transforming the already hazardous job of the U-boat crew into an expeditionary role against both the enemy and the ferocious elements of the Polar Sea. The inherent vulnerability of this logistical thread was the base's single greatest point of failure, a weakness that the relentless Allied counter-strategy would eventually exploit. The challenge was threefold: distance, time, and detection. The journey from the U-boat bases in occupied Norway to the remote outposts in Svalbard involved traversing thousands of miles of open, highly contested waters. This area was the hunting ground of the British Home Fleet, protected by continuous air and naval patrols, aiming to intercept German ships and U-boats operating against the crucial Arctic convoys supplying the Soviet Union. The U-boats assigned to the resupply missions could not follow their normal operational doctrine. They were carrying sensitive personnel, critical supplies, and specialized weather equipment rather than torpedoes for combat. Their mission demanded stealth, not aggression, forcing them to spend longer periods submerged and utilizing more fuel than a typical combat patrol, all while navigating through a treacherous environment of shifting ice, high seas, and deep fog. The risk of discovery, either by Allied ASW patrols or by the accidental encounter with a major naval force, was constant and catastrophic. The second major hurdle was the seasonal constraint. The base could only be reliably resupplied during the brief Arctic summer window, roughly from July to September, when the pack ice receded enough to allow a U-boat to approach the designated landing site. Miss that narrow window, and the men of Haudegen would face another 8 or 9 months of total isolation, their fate reliant on their remaining rations and fuel reserves. This created immense pressure on the U-boat crews and the Kriegsmarine planners to execute the mission with perfect timing, often forcing the U-boats to operate in less than ideal weather conditions or under periods of prolonged Allied air activity. The time spent on the surface during the actual unloading, a critical exposed period where the crew had to transfer provisions and personnel onto the beach, was the most dangerous part of the entire operation. The sight of a U-boat stationary on the surface, its crew exposed to the elements, was the perfect target for any stray Allied patrol aircraft. The logistical thread eventually began to fray under the relentless pressure of the Allied war machine. As the war progressed, and the Allies gained decisive air and sea superiority across the Norwegian Sea, a parallel to the defeat of the U-boats in the Atlantic, the risk associated with the resupply missions became unacceptably high. The specialized U-boats required for these missions were becoming scarcer. Their crews were increasingly inexperienced, and the sheer volume of Allied ASW coverage made successful, undetected delivery nearly impossible. The base was designed to be self-sufficient for a limited time, but its long-term existence was a mathematical impossibility against the mobilization of the Allied naval and air power. The men of Haudegen, fighting their lonely battle against the barometer, were destined to become strategic orphans, their fate sealed not by a direct attack, but by the slow, inexorable tightening of the Allied logistical noose that choked off the supply line across the Northern Sea. The fragility of the Arctic base's support system was the final strategic error, a commitment to a venture that the collapsing German state could no longer afford to maintain. This dependence on a single, vulnerable supply vector, constantly monitored and threatened by the vastly superior Allied resources, underscored the fatal flaw in any German strategy reliant on long-term, remote sustenance. The individual bravery of the U-boat crews on these supply runs was a magnificent spectacle, but ultimately a futile effort against the systematic and overwhelming opposition. The success of Unternehmen Haudegen relied as much on the psychological resilience of its personnel as it did on the technological viability of the U-boat resupply missions. The scientific mission, the meticulous collection and transmission of meteorological data, required a profound level of focus, precision, and discipline, all of which were constantly challenged by the extreme conditions and the crushing weight of total isolation. The human factor, the mental and physical endurance of the isolated team, became a critical variable in the strategic calculation, a vulnerability that no amount of engineering could entirely mitigate. The core scientific mission was deceptively simple: maintain continuous, accurate observations. This required the men, operating in shifts, to venture out into the brutal polar climate several times a day to measure wind speed, humidity, and temperature, often grappling with equipment that was prone to freezing and failure in the severe cold. The raw data was then converted into coded messages using sophisticated encryption systems and transmitted via shortwave radio back to the German command. The precision required for these tasks was immense, as even minor errors in observation or coding could render the entire data set strategically useless, potentially leading to catastrophic miscalculations in Europe. This reliance on technical meticulousness under conditions of extreme stress was the fundamental psychological challenge of the operation. The isolation itself was the base's most formidable psychological enemy. For months, the team was entirely cut off from the outside world, save for the fleeting one-way contact during the radio transmissions. The Arctic environment, with its long periods of darkness in winter and the relentless, blinding light of the midnight sun in summer, played havoc with the human circadian rhythm and mental equilibrium. The lack of social interaction, the monotony of the diet, and the constant low-level threat of the environment created a profound sense of claustrophobia and anxiety. The commanders of these remote stations understood that maintaining morale and psychological cohesion was as vital as maintaining the radio equipment. Strict routines, physical exercise, and the constant necessity of technical work were essential tools used to fight off the debilitating effects of polar madness, the psychological breakdown caused by isolation and darkness. The unique dangers of the Arctic introduced continuous, localized threats that demanded constant vigilance, diverting the team's focus from their primary scientific mission. The immense power of the weather, with sudden, fierce blizzards that could bury the station in snow and ice in hours, required continuous, exhausting physical labor just to keep the communication antennas clear and the generators running. The presence of polar bears, massive and aggressive predators, meant that every venture outside the compound was a potentially lethal risk, forcing the team to maintain a constant armed watch, another drain on their energy and focus. These daily localized battles against the environment and its inhabitants added immense unseen pressure to the scientific mission. The men of Haudegen were not only meteorologists, they were technicians, laborers, doctors, and sentries, a multi-talented, finite resource fighting a multi-front war against nature. The sheer determination of these men to maintain their precise, vital scientific mission under such impossible, soul-crushing conditions stands as a profound testament to the human capacity for endurance, even in the pursuit of a strategically doomed effort. The continuous psychological pressure of their environment was compounded by the knowledge that their vital work was a desperate gamble, a final, fragile attempt to provide a military edge to a collapsing command structure. Their discipline was the ultimate necessary shield against the madness of their isolation. The operation of Unternehmen Haudegen, despite its remoteness, did not escape the relentless, systematic scrutiny of Allied intelligence. As the war progressed and the Allies gained ever-increasing dominance in signals intelligence, SIGINT, and air reconnaissance over the northern European theaters, the secret Arctic bases transitioned from invisible strategic assets to highly vulnerable targets. The closing of the intelligence and operational net around these remote outposts was a deliberate, protracted effort, a strategic manifestation of the technological and logistical supremacy that the Allies now enjoyed. The primary vulnerability of the German bases, including Haudegen, was their necessary reliance on radio transmission. Every time the meteorologists transmitted their vital data, they cast a subtle, invisible electronic signal across the vastness of the Arctic. Allied intelligence, particularly the British Y Service and its listening posts, became increasingly adept at intercepting these coded transmissions. While the German encryption, often using highly sophisticated Enigma machines, was initially robust, the sheer volume of German radio traffic and the inevitable human-driven operational errors provided the Allies with continuous, small-scale breaks in the code. More significantly, the Allies used high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, the same technology that decimated the U-boat wolf packs, to pinpoint the source of the weather transmissions. The moment a German meteorologist sent his data, the Allied Navy gained a rough bearing on his remote location. The silence of the Arctic was being broken by the enemy's own essential communications. Furthermore, Allied air and naval patrols, increasingly operating with impunity in the Norwegian Sea, were actively tasked with routine reconnaissance of the known and suspected German positions in the Arctic. Long-range patrol aircraft, like the consolidated B-24 Liberator, often fitted with advanced radar, performed continuous sweeps of the Svalbard region, pushing the limits of their operational range to seek out the tiny, telltale signs of human activity. The smudge of a generator's exhaust, the flicker of a light in the darkness, or the subtle geometric lines of a prefabricated hut against the chaos of the natural landscape. The risk of detection transitioned from a statistical possibility to a near certainty, forcing the men of Haudegen into a continuous, high-stress state of camouflage and concealment, diverting their energy from the scientific mission to the daily struggle for survival. The Allied response to the Arctic weather bases was not always characterized by direct, immediate attack. Often, the strategy was to simply maintain the intelligence shadow, to know the base's existence and location, and to allow the relentless pressure of isolation, logistical scarcity, and the Arctic environment to slowly choke the life out of the operation. The Germans, fighting for their very existence in Europe, could ill afford the immense resources required for a high-risk resupply mission to a base that the Allies already knew existed. The threat of an Allied strike force was always present, a constant psychological weight that ensured the base's operational lifespan was entirely dependent on Allied forbearance. The men of Haudegen were fighting in a vacuum, convinced of their absolute isolation, unaware that their daily routine of weather measurement was often being tracked, recorded and analyzed by an enemy that commanded the skies and the seas, patiently waiting for the base to collapse under its own weight. The strategic net was closing, and the Arctic outpost was destined to become a forgotten, stranded strategic pawn, its fate sealed by the superiority of Allied information warfare and the ultimate, crushing reality of their resource dominance. The electronic tether of the German scientists, meant to link them to their command, became the very chain that bound them to their eventual defeat. The collapse of the secret Arctic weather base was not signaled by a massive Allied assault or a dramatic tactical defeat. It was a slow, inevitable logistical and strategic starvation, a testament to the fatal flaws in planning that failed to account for the total long-term nature of Allied supremacy. As the German war effort entered its final agonizing year, the men of Unternehmen Haudegen transitioned from being vital strategic assets to being strategic orphans, isolated, forgotten technical experts whose life or death needs were eclipsed by the overwhelming immediate demands of the crumbling fronts in Europe. The core of the collapse lay in the failure of the logistical commitment. The massive German losses in the Battle of the Atlantic, the destruction of the U-boat fleet, and the necessity of deploying every remaining operational submarine to desperate combat roles meant that the high-risk resupply missions to Svalbard were deemed a luxury the Kriegsmarine could no longer afford. The promise of an annual resupply, the single thread of hope that sustained the isolated men, evaporated under the harsh realities of a lost war. As winter approached in 1944, the team knew that the U-boat would not arrive, sealing their fate to endure an indefinite extension of their mission with rapidly dwindling fuel, food, and medical supplies. Their technical proficiency and scientific discipline remained high, but their operational lifespan was dictated by the simple, brutal reality of their remaining canned rations. The strategic value of their meteorological data, while still important, also began to decline relative to the Allies' total intelligence dominance. The success of the Allied code-breaking at Bletchley Park and the extensive use of long-range reconnaissance meant that the German command was becoming increasingly reliant on intercepted enemy intelligence, and less on the slow, precarious data transmissions from the Arctic. The weather station, once a crucial, irreplaceable source of information, was now a minor asset in a losing war, a strategic commitment that the Führer's headquarters had simply forgotten in the chaos of retreat and annihilation. The men of Haudegen were effectively marooned, their skills no longer capable of influencing the final massive battles unfolding far to the south. The eventual end of the base's operational mission came not with enemy fire, but with the silence of the radio. As the war in Europe drew to a close in the spring of 1945, the team, surviving on severely restricted rations and facing the exhaustion of their fuel reserves, made the difficult, ultimate decision to cease transmission. The silence was a deliberate, necessary act of self-preservation, signaling to their command that the mission had ended, and that the long, terrifying wait for rescue had begun. The collapse of the base was a microcosm of the entire German war effort, a brilliant, audacious plan that failed not through lack of courage or technical skill, but through the fatal, unforgivable miscalculation of the long-term industrial and logistical capacity of the enemy. The men of Haudegen were the last Axis personnel to be officially deployed in the field, fighting a lonely, silent war that continued months after the final guns had fallen silent in Berlin. Their story a final, poignant footnote to a total strategic defeat. Their transformation from vital intelligence agents to forgotten survivors solidified their status as the ultimate strategic orphans of the Second World War. Their mission, a casualty of the logistical noose tightened by the Allies. The formal surrender of Germany in May 1945 did not immediately end the war for the men of Unternehmen Haudegen. They remained stranded, prisoners not of the Allies, but of the immense indifferent power of the polar ice and the sheer logistical vacuum left by the collapse of the Kriegsmarine. The team, fully aware that the war was over and that their mission was obsolete, faced a unique and terrifying dilemma. They were the last remaining Axis personnel operating in the field, and their fate now depended entirely on the Allied powers, the very enemy they had been spying on for 2 grueling years, to arrange their extraction. The long wait for rescue was a period of extreme psychological and physical duress, a final, agonizing chapter in their solitary deployment. The first critical decision made by the commander, Dr. Wilhelm Dege, was a matter of protocol and honor. After ceasing their meteorological transmissions, the men remained armed and ready, maintaining military discipline and order. Dege correctly reasoned that a formal surrender to the Allied forces was necessary to secure their rights under the Geneva Convention and to ensure a safe extraction. However, the means of communicating this surrender to the outside world were virtually non-existent. The radio was silent, and the vast, ice-choked ocean offered no viable avenue of escape. They were forced to wait for the arrival of the first ship or aircraft that could penetrate the still-frozen, desolate coastline, a waiting game that stretched through the brief Arctic summer and into the early autumn. Survival during this protracted period became a testament to the team's initial planning and their continued discipline. They relied heavily on their initial, meticulously planned stockpiles, rationing their remaining fuel for warmth and their dwindling food supplies with military precision. The harsh, unforgiving nature of the Arctic, however, was a relentless adversary. The men continued to hunt local game, primarily reindeer, a necessary deviation from their professional roles that supplemented their meager diets and provided vital protein. But the threat of an accident, a medical emergency, or the final exhaustion of their fuel reserves loomed over every hour of their existence. The base, once a scientific outpost, was now a mere survival camp, its occupants reduced to the most basic struggle for life against the elements. The isolation of Houtigan meant that its existence, and the predicament of its men, was largely a footnote in the massive, ongoing effort of the Allied powers to demobilize and process the surrender of millions of German personnel across Europe. The base was a remote, easily forgotten anomaly, an inconvenient logistical problem that the Allied command was in no immediate rush to solve. The men of Houtigan were, in a historical sense, the final official German fighting unit to formally lay down their arms, a fact that underscores the sheer scale and reach of the conflict. Their eventual rescue was not a high-priority military operation, but a necessary, complex logistical arrangement that would finally close the book on this remote, forgotten front. The ordeal of Unternehmen Houtigan stands as a unique coda to the war, a silent, frozen demonstration that even after the final decisive battles have been won, the raw, brutal reality of survival continues until the final soldier has been accounted for. Their adherence to military protocol, demanding a formal surrender to the enemy, was a final, profound act of discipline in the face of the chaos that had consumed their nation. The period of waiting for the men of Unternehmen Houtigan finally came to an end in September 1945, 4 months after the formal surrender of the Third Reich. The final act of this isolated military operation was an exercise in protocol, a strange and anticlimactic formal surrender that highlighted the absurdity of fighting a war long past its conclusion. The surrender was not accepted by a massed military force, but by the captain of a Norwegian sealing vessel, a civilian vessel acting on behalf of the Allied powers. A quiet, fitting conclusion to a secret war fought against the elements rather than large armies. The rescue and acceptance of surrender was ultimately organized by the Norwegian government, which had jurisdiction over Svalbard and possessed the necessary, specialized vessels capable of navigating the ice-choked waters. The German command, having lost all means of communication and transportation, had dispatched the necessary details of the base's location to the Allies, requesting a formal extraction. The vessel that finally reached the remote outpost was the Norwegian sealer Blåsel, commanded by Captain Ludvig Albertsen. For Albertsen and his crew, this was an unusual mission, a blend of rescue and military protocol, requiring the captain to act as the official representative of the victorious Allied nations. This circumstance underscores the low priority and remote nature of the Houtigan operation. The final act of surrender did not warrant a warship or a detachment of combat troops. Upon the arrival of the Blåsel, the German commander, Dr. Wilhelm Dege, executed the final, formal act of surrender with military precision, adhering to the protocols established long before their isolation. The German team, impeccably dressed in their uniforms, marched out to meet the Norwegians, a small, disciplined unit emerging from the desolate white landscape. Dege formally offered his surrender and that of his men to Captain Albertsen, an exchange that must have felt profoundly surreal to both parties. The surrender involved the ceremonial laying down of their remaining arms and the formal transfer of the station's documentation, including their entire archive of meteorological data, the very intelligence that had been the singular reason for their perilous, extended deployment. The data, ironically, was no longer strategically vital, but served as the final, meticulously recorded proof of their scientific mission's successful execution. The most poignant aspect of this unofficial surrender was the exchange of documentation. The German commander presented his team's logbooks, their detailed operational reports, and, crucially, their identity papers. In return, Captain Albertsen presented the German team with official documentation, confirming the final, unconditional surrender of Germany months earlier, bringing the final decisive news to the men who had been entirely cut off from the end of the global conflict. The acceptance of the surrender by a civilian captain on a sealing vessel served as the final symbolic severing of the Axis presence in the Arctic. The men were then carefully loaded aboard the Blåsel for the long journey back to Norway, transitioning from armed combatants to prisoners of war, a status that finally relieved them of the immense, crushing psychological burden of perpetual command and isolation. Their personal war was finally over, concluded not by the roar of cannons, but by the gentle creaking of a civilian icebreaker, a final, anticlimactic scene that perfectly captured the absurd and protracted end of the global conflict. The meticulously collected and archived meteorological data, the entire raison d'être of Unternehmen Haudegen, represented a final, unique prize for the Allied intelligence community. Although the war was over and the immediate strategic value of the data had evaporated, the complete archive of observations, spanning 2 years of continuous polar conditions, was an invaluable resource for scientific and long-range climate study. The transfer and subsequent analysis of this data reveal a final, ironic dimension to the German Arctic experiment. The intelligence was technically perfect, but strategically too late to influence the war's decisive moments. The scientific quality of the captured data was exceptionally high, a testament to the discipline and technical expertise of Dr. Dej and his team. The records, taken under conditions of extreme duress, provided continuous, precise measurements of barometric pressure, temperature, and wind patterns over the Norwegian Sea, a vital region for understanding North Atlantic weather systems. For Allied meteorologists, this uninterrupted stream of data, previously only available through fragmented aerial reconnaissance, was a treasure trove that filled critical gaps in their long-term climate models. The data proved the strategic hypothesis of the German command. The Arctic was indeed the essential weather factory influencing the battlegrounds of Europe. The German effort had been scientifically sound. It was merely strategically outpaced. However, the war had already been won through the superior application of technology and logistics, effectively neutralizing the need for this precise, remote data. The Allies' own sophisticated weather forecasting capabilities, combined with the comprehensive intelligence derived from code-breaking and vast aerial reconnaissance, had already provided the necessary margin of safety for the D-Day landings and the Battle of the Atlantic. While the data from Haudegen was scientifically valuable for post-war climate research, its failure to arrive in time for crucial military planning underscored the fundamental flaw of the entire German strategic approach: an over-reliance on brilliant, localized solutions that could not be sustained or effectively integrated into a collapsing command structure. The strategic system had failed the technical team, not the other way around. The intelligence prize of Haudegen was, therefore, a final, poignant piece of evidence, confirming the scale of the German effort and the brilliance of their technical specialists. It demonstrated the lengths to which the Axis powers were willing to go to gain any marginal strategic advantage in the face of overwhelming material disadvantage. The men of the weather station had delivered the data, often risking their lives in the process, fulfilling their mission with total professional commitment. Yet, the war was a race against time, and the logistical vulnerability of the U-boat supply line, coupled with the inevitable collapse of the German communications network, ensured that the Arctic intelligence, once transmitted, was often received too late or was too fragmented to provide a decisive edge. The transfer of the meteorological archives marked the final, symbolic acceptance by the Allies that the German threat, once global in reach, had been reduced to a handful of paper documents surrendered on a frozen, forgotten island, their contents proving the tactical value of an operation that was strategically obsolete. The story of the Haudegen team occupies a unique and significant place in the narrative of the Second World War. They were officially the last uniformed Axis personnel to surrender their arms in the field. This singular distinction, occurring months after the final surrender on the continent, elevates their isolated ordeal from a mere logistical footnote into a powerful symbolic coda to the massive global conflict. Their longevity in the field, surviving 2 Arctic winters and the total collapse of their nation, speaks volumes about the remote scale of the war and the commitment of individual soldiers far from the main battlegrounds. The journey of the Haudegen men from the Arctic back to Norway and into official prisoner of war status, was a final, stark reminder of the massive logistical machine the Allies had mobilized. They were processed and interrogated, not because they possessed high-value intelligence, that was largely outdated, but because their deployment represented a unique example of extreme remote operations. The Allied interrogators were more interested in the technical and logistical challenges they had faced, how the equipment had survived the cold, the specifics of the U-boat supply runs, and the methods used to combat isolation and maintain scientific precision. Their technical expertise was quickly recognized, and their treatment under the Geneva Convention was largely respectful, reflecting the nature of their scientific non-combatant mission. Their unique expertise in Arctic survival and meteorology ensured that their post-war utility was high, transitioning from German POWs to consultants for post-war scientific expeditions in the North Atlantic. The longevity of Haudegen also highlights the inherent strategic flaws in the German High Command's resource allocation. The commitment to maintaining a remote scientific outpost, consuming valuable U-boat patrols and high-caliber personnel, persisted long after the main, decisive battle for the Atlantic had been lost. This demonstrated a fatal inability to correctly prioritize resources, a classic symptom of a fragmented, collapsing command structure that allowed small, ambitious projects to continue long past their strategic expiration date. The men in Svalbard were not defeated by a superior enemy force. They were defeated by the strategic neglect of their own command and the overwhelming logistical competence of the Allies, who simply waited for the polar environment to complete the attrition process. The narrative of the last soldiers to surrender provides a crucial, humanizing perspective on the end of the conflict. For the Haudegen team, the war did not end with the massive celebrations in May 1945. It ended with a quiet, formal handshake on a desolate beach in September. Their story underscores the fact that the total war extended to the furthest, most unforgiving corners of the globe, requiring immense sacrifice and commitment from technical experts and soldiers alike. The legacy of Unternehmen Haudegen is a final, quiet testament to the scale of the Second World War, a conflict so vast that its final official act took place on a remote Norwegian island, fought by scientists who were simply trying to read a barometer. The ultimate verdict on the secret Arctic base, Unternehmen Haudegen, confirms a defining strategic truth of the Second World War. Brilliance in localized execution cannot compensate for a total failure in global logistics and strategic prioritization. The German Arctic experiment, while a technological marvel in its isolated deployment and scientific precision, ultimately failed because it was a strategic luxury that the collapsing German war machine could not afford to sustain against an adversary with superior resource management and control over the sea and the air. The operation's failure was a direct result of the unforgivable miscalculation of the logistical envelope. The German planners failed to account for the catastrophic scale of the U-boat losses in the Battle of the Atlantic, which instantly severed the base's lifeline. The entire mission was predicated on the continued viability of the Kriegsmarine to project power and maintain resupply corridors, a viability that was crushed by the Allied system of Huff Duff, Hedgehog, and the Liberty ship. The base's continued existence became a direct mathematical function of the Allied logistical counter-strategy, confirming that in modern total war, control of the supply chain is the single most decisive factor, overriding any localized technological or scientific advantage. The legacy of Haudegen provides a crucial strategic lesson. Remote, specialized assets, no matter how vital the intelligence they provide, are inherently vulnerable when the command structure loses control of the intermediate and global theaters of operations. The Allied strategy of strategic neglect, knowing the base was there but choosing to let the environment and isolation do the work, was a powerful demonstration of resource conservation, a tactic made possible by the confidence in their total air and sea superiority. They did not need to spend precious bombs or ships on the outpost. They simply needed to wait. The men of Haudegen were the final, symbolic casualties of this strategic imbalance. Their sacrifice, characterized by professionalism and extreme endurance, was strategically necessary for the German High Command, but ultimately futile in its impact on the war's outcome. The captured meteorological data confirmed the scientific brilliance of the team, but the timing of its surrender confirmed the final strategic verdict. The war was won and lost on the scale of industrial production and logistical resilience, not in the isolated heroism of a few men reading a barometer on a frozen island. The story of the secret Arctic base remains a powerful, silent monument to the global reach of the Second World War and the overwhelming finality of the Allied victory. The fate of the strategic orphans in the Arctic was a final, undeniable proof that the war's outcome had been determined years earlier, in the shipyards and factories, long before the last shots were fired.